Darren, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Hey, you too.
We've
Thanks
been
for having me
talking.
on.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking off mic for a few minutes. We brought up pronunciation of last names.
Yours looks a little trickier than mine, but
Yeah, so mine, you were saying that yours has German origin.
mhm.
My last name is spelled, I guess, the German way, because my grandfather was in a Nazi labor camp that was liberated by American GIs after World War II, and he was a displaced person. He wound up in Germany. So Terletsky is, probably like Zelensky spells it with K-Y-Y,
Mhm.
It's probably a more phonetic spelling for my last name, but the CKYJ is common among people with origins that come from Western Ukraine and that were, I guess, victims of the Nazi invasion 80 years ago.
Yeah, I'm used to strange spellings of things. I grew up in New Jersey, just outside New York City, so hung out with Dan Wierzinski and learned how how names are actually, wow, okay. My last name is Gerdes, not it's Gerdes. I sat next to a German businessman and asked once, I wrote it down and said, how do you pronounce it? He's like, Gerdes, and like rolled something. I can't even do it. And while it's of German origin, my grandfather escaped just before the Nazis. Like he got out in 39. And the reason he got out was because he became a Christian, and the Soviet, not Soviet, but the communists in Germany started harassing him, threatening to kill his daughter. And so he left and packed up and went to the United States. And so that spared my whole family line because of that. So, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, that was just before the Nazis came to power. Actually, no, sorry, this was 33. The Nazis come to power in 39. 29, sorry, 29. And then dad's born in 33. Nazis come to power in 39. Sorry.
Yeah, it's an incredible story for anybody that's in this country, essentially. I mean, it's good and bad. There's
And
so
from
much.
here, we get to have this vantage point to see things through the lens of freedom that so much of the world is not able to have. I mean, right now, Ukraine's been plunged into this darkness that they didn't bring on. I mean, and everybody can see it. I gave this analogy when we're talking about like what happened. It was a month ago yesterday, like a full month, right? The 28th was a few days before that, but actually we're now to a full month. And Zelensky pointed this out in his most recent speeches about how, look, this has been going on for a full month. But on the 24th, because on the 24th, the best analogy, people would say things like, well, it looks like somebody beating up a kid on the school ground. It's not exactly right. There's more nuance to the story. It's like a middle schooler is at his kitchen table doing his math homework, right? Minding his own business, just doing his math homework like he's supposed to, doing his due diligence. And an ex-convict kicks in the door. And you're like, you're looking at this like, oh, this is going to be bad. And like, I remember looking at it on the 24th or 25th thinking like, oh man, this is going to be bad. But then over time, you realize the storyline has changed a little bit. That middle schooler realizes his baby brother and sister are sleeping in the back room, and he grabs the kitchen knife and he starts swinging wildly at the ex-con. And now you're thinking, whoa, the ex-con might get it. I mean, it might. And when you're looking at this, it's a really incredible thing. And I got to give Zelensky crazy props for his effort, his standing up, his leadership. As you know, the reason that I'm even on here is because I'm a professor who teaches leadership and power and influence and all those kinds of courses, and wrote about Zelensky. I put a book up on Kindle in very short order because I just became fascinated with the guy. And I mean, so let me do this. I'll try to let me scratch where you itch. What questions do you have about Zelensky, or how can I focus this for your audience?
Well, here's where I want to go, or here's where I want to begin, I guess. So you were talking about people in the West looking at this conflict and saying, holy smokes,
Mhm.
this is going to be bad for Ukraine. And let's be objective, it is.
Oh
It's
yeah.
horrible. Everything that's happened. I mean, no one, I guess no one in the West expected the Ukrainian forces to be able to put up a fight. And here we are over a month later, and they're even on the offensive, taking back territory in certain regards. And
They are.
the utter failures of the Russian forces and the cracks in the system are showing now, and it's surprising. On the other hand, you know this, that I was a major Zelensky critic up until about a month ago.
And everybody should have been. Like, look, I mean, when I went and looked at the backstory of Zelensky, I'm like, you know, this, okay, so everybody, as they're finding things out, they find out, oh, he was an actor that was playing the president. And then when he got elected with 73% of the vote. Okay, so high expectations. I don't know how anybody lives up to that kind of expectation. That's part one.
Well,
Part two,
Ukrainians like
COVID.
to kick out incumbents. That's the thing. They get tired. People come in with promises,
Well,
and they don't.
so good for
fulfill them.
Zelensky. He said he was going to only run for one term. And if he does endure through this, and I hope and pray that he makes it, right? If he
Yeah.
does endure through this and then sits out one term, he will be a godlike figure ongoing in Ukraine forever. In the world, he'll be like up there with Gandhi and MLK as far as, you know, I mean, like, he's
Yeah.
set. Now, the worst thing that can happen to him is that power goes to his head and then he decides to stay forever. That
Well,
would
how
be the
does he
worst.
remain? He's been such an inspiring wartime leader.
You can remain at standing off to the side,
Yeah.
being a figurehead, like a Mother Teresa. She has no power, right? So that's what I hope he does. I don't know if he'll do it or not, because look, Vladimir Putin's been there for 20 years. When you're there in power, like, after a certain amount of time, you don't have anything more to bring to the table. But power goes to your head the longer you stay in power. That's generally the dynamic. But he said he would be there for one term. His term was looking rough, right? I mean, so he didn't really do as much about corruption as we thought. And maybe you can fill in some backstory here too. COVID was bad for every president. 25% approval rate by the time we get to October, November, and then February 24th, everything changes. In my book, it's called I Need Ammunition, Not a Ride. And that's where I first heard him and went, whoa, who is this guy? Because, like, Americans, what do we know about Zelensky other
That's like
than
a
the Trump
let's
impeachment?
roll, almost like in 9/11 when those
That's right.
heroes
It's
tried to
right
take
up there
down that
with
airplane.
Let's Roll and Nuts. Right in
Yeah.
World War II, McAuliffe, when he asked to surrender at Bastogne, his reply is nuts. And Patton says to that, well, man, that articulate deserves to be rescued. And that's kind of what my approach was. I was like, wow. He said, what? I need to find out about this guy. Okay, so at any rate, he has this 25% approval rating. February 24th rolls around, and he just becomes awesome. Now, there's an analog to it, and I talk about that in the book. Rudy Giuliani, 9/11, right? He's America's mayor. Why? Because he was everywhere. He was on the ground, taking names, making sure everything was happening, directing the resources masterfully. But on 9/10, he was a lame duck philanderer who was just biding his time out because he had a cancer diagnosis. So he dropped out of the race against Hillary Clinton, which could have been a real horse race. The guy that ran against Hillary had no chance, right? But it could have been a real horse race. Like, so his career was in the tank. His personal life was in shambles. 9/11 happens and he rises. And there's something really interesting about somebody who rises. Sometimes there's a peacetime general who's a terrible wartime general, and there's great wartime generals who are terrible peacetime generals. This might have been what's going on here, right? Like, he might not have been the best politician. In fact, he was not the best, by a long shot. He wasn't the best politician. Part of it was rookie mistakes. Part of it, I half like the guy and half don't like the guy as a politician.
Well, let me ask you this: how do you view this aspect of it? Leading up to this broader invasion, because I don't like to call it an invasion because it started 8 years ago.
Yeah, you're right.
But
you're right. And
if
we as Americans aren't even really paying attention. We didn't pay attention to 2004. We didn't pay attention to 2008 in Georgia. We didn't pay attention to 2014, which is when this really began.
And I'm worried that the attention is waning again because the media narrative isn't changing. It's the Russians are attacking and the Ukrainians are trying to beat them back. And because there's no new sensational development other than the drudge of war, it seems like coverage in the United States is already starting to veer off into other directions. And I'm worried too, because this fight is so important, not only to me as a Ukrainian American, but I think to the security of Europe, to the security of the world. It's important that we remain focused and that we support Ukraine. That's my position for certain.
Yeah, but I don't. So I think that the major media may be doing that a little bit, but I think the rest of us are waking up. Look, I'm half Irish and half German. I have no stake in Ukraine. I'm about as neutral and objective, outsider as possible, right? But I'm looking at it, and all the sympathy lies. I had this thought just this morning, because I was catching up, making sure I had read up through, because I read all the speeches, and in his speech, it was either to the G7 or European Union just yesterday. He was talking about he was cataloging all the things that the Russians had done to him. Like, he was just like listing out over and over again all the atrocities. And I'm thinking, like, he's like the anti-terrorist. All the sympathy is with Ukraine. Like, think about a terrorist. A terrorist goes in, blows up a building, and then people hate the terrorist because the terrorist is just trying to create all that. He's like the anti-terrorist. All this stuff has happened to him. He's a sympathy. He is the focal point of the sympathy for the people of Ukraine, because it's all being happening to him. He's not inviting it. The worst thing he could do is drop a bomb on Moscow. Like, if you had a plane and you could go and bomb them back, don't do that. Just because it would hurt your sympathy. Like, the rest of the world is pouring in 100,000 tons of humanitarian aid so far. It was cataloged a week ago, coming into Ukraine. All that is coming in, all the weapons, all the help, there are Americans on the ground that are, some of these guys are Gen Xers that remember, what was it? Wolverines. What was the name of that? I can't remember the name of the movie. Red Dawn, right? I mean, they're ex-military going for the fight, and they're on the ground. Okay, so all of that good stuff is happening because we can see who's clearly the victim and who is the vampire.
Well, Zelensky's saying in all of his speeches too that the Ukrainians' goal is not to attack Russia; it's to protect their own land. And it's interesting because leading up to this, I would pay attention to Ukrainian social media, and Zelensky's poll numbers were down and criticism was up, and people that had supported him in his election campaign were now waning and waiting for the next election. And every time he gave a speech, pozor is a Ukrainian word for shame. They would say it's shameful, it's an embarrassment, he can't speak. And suddenly, someone who was primarily a Russian speaker is giving an amazing oratory in the Ukrainian language, looking at the camera and undressing European leaders like the president of Hungary, Viktor Orban. Just the other day, I saw Zelensky saying, pick a side. I mean,
you got to stand with us.
Yeah.
Now, that was after he cataloged, I have right here in front of me. That was after he cataloged who was on their side. And this was to the European Union. Right. And saying like Lithuania is with us, Estonia is with us, Slovakia is with us. And then he was going through Ireland, you're almost with us. Right. And he went through, it was funny, right? Like, he was asking who, but then he spent like 2 paragraphs on Hungary. I want to stop here and be honest once and for all. You have to decide for yourself, who are you with? You are a sovereign state. I've been to Budapest. I adore your city. I've been many times. Very beautiful, very hospitable. And the people too. You have tragic moments in your life. I visited your waterfront. I saw this memorial, Shoes in the Danube Bank, about mass killings. I was there with my family. Listen, Victor, do you know what's going on in Mariupol? Please, if you can, go to your waterfront. Wow. Now, he's done this with everything. He's like the communicator in chief. He's been likened to Reagan and Churchill and whatever. I think Reagan's a really interesting analog for him, because every speech he gets in, he pairs it to who, like, he connects Ukraine to them very closely.
His propagandists were saying in his election campaign, that he's just like Reagan. That's what they were saying.
There were
No, I'm saying
like Reagan.
Well, there were criticisms and support, but what I'm saying is the television channels in Ukraine, So, the news media, it's not like it is, well, it is, in a sense, it is like it is here, because you have Fox News and MSNBC that have an agenda. Just like in every country now, the news has an agenda. There are a few that are sort of independent or try to be objective, but the ones that were pro Zelensky leading up to his, or in his election campaign, were saying, this is why he's like Reagan, and why, Reagan was so great, and this is why Zelensky's going to be so great. And then the other criticisms were, well, was Reagan really that great? And do we need an actor playing the part of the real president? So
I
all
think
of
that has
that kind of
helped him.
stuff was being parroted on Ukrainian television.
Yeah, and you know what Reagan's response was when he was asked that. I talk about it in the book. When Reagan was asked by as candidate Reagan, he hadn't become president yet. He's asked, how can an actor be president? And he replied to the reporter, how can a president not be an actor? And I think there's something like that's really serving Zelensky. His previous life, like, he has no military background, right? But his previous life really served him well for this. He's like Reagan 2.0, not in philosophy, but in the way that he masterfully communicates through social media. It regularly puts out videos. Like even when he ran a Biden way, not a Trump way. Trump was trying to create rallies. He was, I'm going to put out a video here, a video there, right? It was very social media savvy, that kind of thing. But
that was one of my criticisms of him. So
I know I would criticize him too, but I gotta give him props. It was clever. He used his strength, right? His strength was not to debate one-on-one when he was a novice. And Poroshenko had a great resume, just like Hillary Clinton did. Hillary Clinton had a great resume, right? So, I mean, if you use the analog,
but in Ukraine, that's the story. It's elections promising reform. So from the Orange Revolution, Yushchenko, and then, you have the reversion back to the authoritarian eastward leaning bent. Then Poroshenko comes in after the Maidan Revolution of Dignity.
Yep.
And then you could argue too that Zelensky is sort of a continuation of that trajectory of Ukraine that was going westward, that was going toward pluralism, democracy, and all of that. But that was one of my main criticisms of Zelensky coming in, other than, he's not qualified. He doesn't know what he's doing. You're not sure. And there's questions about,
it's kind of true.
Yeah. What are his intentions? There's all kinds of talk about which oligarchs, which leaders are aligned with, and whether or not they can, what are their interests in Ukraine other than to just steal from the public. And so that's a concern. And they all say they're going to reform. Yushchenko said he was going to reform. Poroshenko said he was going to reform and weed out corruption. Zelensky said the same thing, and none of them really truly delivered. And when I did a video on social media, I'm just a guy, but I have this platform here that I've created on my own. And in Ukrainian, I said, the first utterance was, okay, I can't vote in the Ukrainian election because I'm American. And I said that in Ukrainian. And that line apparently made the video go viral. Some people didn't believe I was an American. Some people thought it was, who knows who's behind that video. But at the end, I said, I'm American, third generation. I speak Ukrainian better than Volodymyr Zelensky. And if you notice all of his videos, when he speaks to you, he never looks in the camera. It's not him looking at the phone or the camera and just talking to you. It's highly edited, polished, and it's very controlled. But since that time,
now,
especially in the last month,
what's needed. So honestly, right now, he has done a masterful job of controlling it. That TV producer background that he has been exactly what's needed in this hour. And let me go back to something. So in every one of his speeches, when he's talking to different groups, he is tying them to Ukraine. He's saying, look, this isn't just about Ukraine. Europe, we are Europeans. If this happens here, Moldova's next, right? And then, so he's tying them to their fate. When he talks to Britain, he invoked Churchill. That wasn't an accident. When he talked to the United States, did you watch that? I watched that. And I showed my class that video in my Power and Influence class because it was better than anything that I had shown them before. Right. And this was just a week ago.
You're talking about his when his speech to Congress.
His speech to Congress.
Yeah.
Yeah, wasn't that powerful? So it's powerful for a couple of reasons. One, he's invoking Mount Rushmore, which wasn't that great. Martin Luther King, which was better. 9/11 and Pearl Harbor, which really resonated. Like Goosebumps resonated. Like, I mean, it was a thing. Then he shows that powerful video of, you know, a peaceful Ukraine and then a bombed out Ukraine. I was like tearing seeing a man crying over his child, right? Then he speaks in English. Now he can speak in English. He passed the TOEFL because he was going to go to, he was planning to potentially study in Israel. And so he passed the TOEFL when he was a young man. So he spoke primarily Russian, can speak Ukrainian, apparently, and he can speak English. But when he switched gears, and spoke in English and said, Joe Biden, I want to speak to you that you know, you're the leader of the world. Be the leader of peace in the world. Whoa, like, so he did that with America. When he talked to Canada, he said, Justin, well, how would you tell your children when bombs fell on Edmonton, when Vancouver is blockaded, when the CN Tower is hit with a missile? How do you explain that to your children? Powerful. When he talked to the Japanese, he was talking about Chernobyl and relating that to Fukushima, which had an earthquake, by the way, a week earlier. Right. So even what was it, Sweden, the flag, the colors of the flag, that's how he tied them together, right? So I mean, I'm sure he has speech writers and, you know, works out this. It's not just him, but he's smart enough to really work this. So as communicator in chief, like if you told me, so now that's only the speech side, the actions on the ground side are really what's compelling. That he stayed in Kiev, not is calling for resistance from a hotel in Paris. Right, he stayed in Kiev. He knows he's target number one, and he said, "You know, my wife and family are here in Ukraine. We are not traitors." You know, I was telling my wife about that the day I read that, and I was like, you know, honestly, I would have sent you and the kids out, and she said, I would have gone.
So many leaders in similar circumstances throughout history have fled.
In the 20th century alone, you have about 24 that have done that.
Yeah.
21st century alone.
And anything he would have to say outside of the territory of Ukraine would have no consequence.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So he rallied the people because of his personal example beyond his speeches, which have been masterful. So like if you had told me, you know, I'm a professor, right? So if you had told me that on day 23, if I assigned, or February 23, I assign you a paper, I say, okay, the Russians have amassed 150,000 plus troops on your border. You are the president of Ukraine. What do you do? And then you filled it in with everything that Zelensky has done and said since the 24th. I've given you an A+. I mean, the guy has been, there's only one place that I have, and I've criticized this in the article that hopefully will be coming out shortly. It's in press. But there's only one place where he has disappointed me since the thing began.
Where's that?
Banning political parties. And same day, this was last Sunday, banning political parties and consolidating state media. Now, I get why he did it. I understand it. And as an American, I fully recognize that he's not an American, right? He's a Ukrainian with a Soviet hangover, and he's a reformer in some sense. If you look at the platform of the Servant of the People Party, half of them are like free marketeer kind of ideas, and half of them are like Soviet era hangover kind of thing. So he's kind of a mixed bag with that. So I understand he's not an American. I got it. But it's still a bad idea. And you can lose the sympathy of the West by undermining pillars of democracy that we hold dear. So I hope he doesn't do it. In fact, I wrapped up that article saying, you know, this is his first big strategic mistake. I hope it's his last because he can't afford too many. Right? He really can't afford to lose his support. His victory, if he can be victorious, and I think he can now, his victory is predicated on the support of the West. That they have to do the fighting in Ukraine. Like, I'm not discounting that at all, but he has to have the support from them in order to be able to carry on the fight, and you can't undermine that. So that's my only significant criticism of what he's done. But as a wartime leader, he gets very high marks from me.
Well, even before that, his administration overseeing the investigation against Poroshenko for treason for buying gas from the occupied Donbas territories. It's repeating the exact same mistake that Yanukovych made with Yulia Tymoshenko, creating, basically resurrecting the political career of a thwarted rival in some sense, and
Yeah.
then also appearing to be an authoritarian. I had no criticism of shutting down the pro-Russian media in Ukraine, because the argument in my mind was, who's paying for this? You're pumping Russian propaganda into the Ukrainian public. Now, I get from the American perspective that point of view speech should be protected, right? So that we shouldn't.
Wait, look, people in Ukraine aren't looking east for another 3 generations after this.
Sure.
It's an overcorrection that doesn't have to be. I understand.
On the other hand, though, there are people that did believe it. So up until this reinvasion, up until this wider reinvasion, there certainly were people in parts of Ukraine who got their news from.
I believe that. Yeah, absolutely. But we're talking about last Sunday, right? As we speak, it's Saturday, March 26th.
No, I'm talking about before this.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah, but I would tend to agree with you. I mean, banning political parties, consolidating state media, that's a problem. Because, for example, I've interviewed journalists from Prямый Kanal, and that was a major network in Ukraine that was critical of the president up until this happened. And of course, you need dissenting opinions. That's part of what democracy is all about.
Absolutely. So I just think it's an unnecessary overreaction that could hurt him. I don't think it has yet, but it just gives. Look, it's almost like he gave his enemies that otherwise would have no reason to be against him, people that could become enemies, a stick to beat him with. and he didn't need to do it. But again, he's a wartime leader, and this is new to him. He's made far more mistakes politically than he has, as a political leader, than he has as a wartime leader. So again, I'm very impressed with him.
Although Lincoln did acquire some extraordinary powers during the Civil War.
That's correct. FDR did, Lincoln did. I'm not saying that this is without precedent. I'm just saying, don't do that. Since I put the book out, I get people that'll like message me on social media and just like instant message like, hey, did he actually ban political parties? I got to write about this.
Well,
too.
Now you're getting into Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson land. Right.
Yeah. And, it's fascinating you described yourself the other day as not being terribly conservative in a little bit, but you're generally on the other side. I'm on the other side of that equation. And there's a really interesting general harmony between conservatives and liberals right now about their view of Ukraine, with some exceptions like Gabbard and Tucker. Right. I can watch CNN for most of it until they start talking about how racist people are because of X, Y, or Z. Whenever they're covering Ukraine, all that evaporates, and they're just talking about the same thing that I'm on the same page with. And same thing with Fox News is largely that until Tucker Carlson starts speaking. And so there's this weird nexus of Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson, and their nexus is really talking points that are very similar to Russian talking points. And it's a bizarre thing to watch. I mean, they say politics make strange bedfellows, but it really does.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would describe myself as center left. I try to find the reason in it. I see it when I talk about liberalism, I'm thinking of the sort of the classical liberalism, where sort of my view is, free markets with some reasonable barriers from things like monopolies, or, we want clean water, we want clean air, sort of reasonable regulations. And then we can debate on what's too overreach, what's too much within those boundaries. When you go into these sort of demagoguery realms, or these figures that are on the extremes of both the left and the right, every bit of rationality and reasonableness seems to evaporate into thin air. Because on the one hand, so I grew up in Michigan, right? And so I'm familiar with Michigan politics. The former Detroit uh, chief of police is running for the Republican nomination for governor of Michigan to challenge the Gretchen Whitmer, and he's African American. He's a Trump
The guy with the
supporter.
cowboy hat.
No, I don't think he wears a cowboy hat,
Okay.
but I might be wrong. I've mostly just listened to him, but the the point I'm trying to make is he was on Tucker Carlson recently comparing himself to Zelensky because he was saying that
Unless you're Churchill or Reagan or something like that. I mean, like even Reagan's a little bit of a stretch. Churchill's a much better analog as a wartime leader. Washington, I've seen Church. I've compared him to Giuliani, Reagan, Washington, Churchill, and I've seen many others do those same kind of things. I don't think anybody should be running around comparing themselves to Zelensky. Unless you're going through the kinds of things that he's going through, which is just, I mean, it's incredible what this guy has had to endure.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, if somebody's comparing you to Zelensky, I suppose there's some kind of, I don't know, there could be some kind of
That's a
merit in that,
compliment. But if you're
yeah, that's
comparing
a
yourself
compliment.
to
There should be more Zelenskys in the way that he's been, if you're saying in politics, somebody who's standing on principle, or somebody who's that, inspiring his people or her people in the way that he is. But it's James Craig. I just looked it up. The name escaped me for a minute, but James Craig. So he's running for governor, and he compared himself to Zelensky because on Tucker Carlson, because he was claiming that the riots that happened during the COVID era and during the lockdowns and during what happened after George Floyd didn't happen in Detroit because of his work or something along those lines. I'm probably messing up whatever the comparison was. It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't really make sense now. But on Tucker Carlson, you have it when it suits you. Zelensky, as an example, is a positive figure. When it doesn't, it's used as, it's amazing what I hear. It's something like,
yeah, I don't understand Tucker running off. I generally like Tucker Carlson, but he runs off into weird territory sometimes, and I'm like, okay, interesting perspective.
well, I don't want to go
But
too far into the weeds of politics, but when he said to me, what triggers me, I'll use that term, triggered me, is that if Tucker Carlson says something like, Western civilization is the superior civilization, he's handing over sort of rhetoric to somebody who's going to use that in a very negative way. So if you're saying that, okay, the rule of law and the tradition of rule of law and equal treatment under the law and sort of the legal tradition that we have coming from whatever the Judeo-Christian
yeah,
sort of,
I got you. I'm following.
you know what I'm talking about, then yeah, that's great. Liberalism is great. Small L liberalism is great. All of those things are great. But when you say it's the superior civilization, you're running into territory where what I hear and what rolls around in my head is, okay, when does it cross the line from just, you're talking about sort of a tradition of legal precedent, or are you talking about a certain race or class or ethnic group? I don't think that's an
Yeah,
unfair
I
criticism.
don't think he's dog whistling, because fundamentally I'm a conservative, right? And I didn't even think that. Like I go, yeah, of course they are. I mean, look at the heritage of rights and liberties and freedom. So different people from different sides of the spectrum will see it differently.
Right.
And
But then here's the other thing that I see. You hear stories about, if you read about the Old West, or you read about, the United States as we were moving westward and taking territory from the natives. Every once in a while, you'd have a story where somebody from, a European background was taken by or went to live with the natives, right?
mm-hmm.
And then when they would be, let's say, captured back and brought into Western society, sometimes they would flee back. And you never had the opposite. You never had somebody who grew up in a native culture say, oh, I want to go live with the white man.
So I'm out of my depth here, because I this is not something that I have any expertise on.
Sure.
But you might be right. As far as Tucker goes, I don't know why he has the story that he has, but that is not the conservative position or the conservative view in general. If you go to other news
Let's talk
programs, and
about
I
that.
have actually in the last few weeks watched things on more, even more conservative news networks like One American News or the First, or these other stations, Newsmax, that are lesser known but more conservative. You don't hear that. You don't hear it's in general, the conservative wing of America is like pro-Ukrainian. Now, here's the interesting thing. So I was with this one group of like rabidly conservative folks the other day who are kind of like a little closer to the conspiracy wing, right? And they're like asking me questions about, well, is he a Nazi? No, he's not a
Oh,
Nazi.
Zelensky?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So no, he's not a Nazi.
a
Well, what
Jewish
about
Nazi.
the bio labs? Okay, God. And so we're going in through all these things, but there, somebody said something like, well, how is Ukraine all of a sudden good? No, it's not that Ukraine is all of a sudden good. Now, this might be the most controversial thing that I say here, because like and again, I'm an objective third party, but Ukraine is still a pretty corrupt place. And you're going to agree with me on that. I would imagine there, I mean, 120 something, 125, 126 Transparency International out of 160. I mean, they're in the third category, above repressed, but not by a whole lot. A 130 on the Heritage Index, it still has issues, right? So it's not that, Ukraine is now rainbows and sunshine. They still had issues, but they're clearly the victim here. They're fighting for their own freedom. How can you not see that element and say that's the good side? The ones going in there unnecessarily beating them up, they're the bad guys.
Well,
So
here's one of the major differences between Ukraine and Russia in that regard. Russia is also very corrupt.
yeah,
But
they
you
are.
have,
It's a little less corrupt on Transparency and Heritage Index, but it's still
okay,
corrupt.
yeah, I'll
It's
give you
still in
that.
that third category.
I'll give you that.
I
However, when you look at I guess the independent polling coming out of Russia, the majority of people, and I haven't seen anything to dispute this, the majority of Russians, and they're being fed lies, obviously, but the
oh
majority of
sure.
Russians support this war effort by Russia, although they
I
don't
mean, that's
call
the
it.
propaganda
Right.
that's very clear.
Sure, but at the same time, when you look at Ukraine, for example, right, in the last 30 years, elected 6 presidents in competitive elections. You have the civil society in Ukraine that's leaps and bounds ahead of its leadership. These sort of, hat changing, suit changing, party changing leadership that just, goes with the wind to try to maintain power is ingrained in this corruption. But you see the trajectory going towards Western democracy, going towards transparency in Ukraine. And even after the last revolution, when they kicked out Viktor Yanukovych, I just talked to somebody in Ukraine the other day on my podcast, and they were saying, yeah, we thought that after the bloodshed that happened there, that people wouldn't tolerate corruption. And I guess the election of Zelensky is proof of that, because they elected him on the promise that he was going to oust
And this is why he
corrupt
was
politicians.
such a big hit as the actor playing Holoborodko, or whatever, however you pronounce his
Yeah,
name. How do you
Holoborodko, I
pronounce
think.
that? Do
Yeah,
you know?
I think it's Holoborodko. I didn't watch the whole series. I started it, and it kind of veered off there. So I kind of want to
But his rant, that
the
rant
rants,
echoes the
yeah,
people's.
yeah.
So he's done this with both the rant on in episode 1 of Servant of the People, because
Sure.
I watched most of it's on Netflix now, right?
Episode 1 is good. I'll give you that.
Yeah. So that rant echoed, it embodied the
Yeah.
spirit of the people. It gave them voice. And that's something that I say in the book, right? What he's doing in his speeches is being the voice, being the channel, the focus of the people's voice out to the rest of the world. Our fight is your fight.
But then the series veered off into this sort of criticism of what they were calling Ukrainian nationalism, and trying to say that languages don't matter and things like that. And we were talking about Douglas.
I'm not concerning myself with
Yeah,
that.
I know you're not concerning yourself with that, but it's sort of, I just want to kind of touch upon this just to give us a baseline of where we're talking.
Mhm.
Lviv a city in Western Ukraine that a lot of people have heard about now because it's close to Poland. It's sort of been the place where people, the destination, right? Because it's
That's
relatively
what
safe.
best. Dan Wierzinski, a childhood friend of mine, was his folks were from Lviv.
Yeah, that's the only province that didn't vote for Zelensky.
Mhm.
And it's, it was even Yanukovych called it sort of the Geno Fund of Ukraine. It was sort of the capital of Ukrainian culture, right?
Mhm.
Because the vast majority of Ukraine was part of Stalin's Soviet Union before it incorporated Western Ukraine, and there was a genocide that happened there.
Yeah,
And
31 to 34.
And like what they're, or 30, well, we say 32 to 33. But you're in that
I'm
range.
giving you the broader
You're in that range. Yeah.
time.
You had more, well, sure. But it's happening now, Mariupol.
Yep.
The Russian forces have just bombarded that city, killed so many people unjustifiably. There are reports that they're taking account of who's left. And the idea is, and what's being promoted is, we're going to take people out, send them to Siberia, and repopulate with Russian.
They're taking children out.
Yeah.
How horrible is that? Thousands of children have been taken out. I mean,
how is that not genocide too? I mean, how is that not genocide?
So on many levels, the rest of the world looking at this, and again, Zelensky's doing his role, and he's performing a role that only he can really perform as the mouthpiece, the figurehead for the state, and he's doing it masterfully, saying, "Look, this is everything that's going on," and he did this to the either the G7 or the European Union, listed all the atrocities, including children being abducted, hospitals being bombed, schools being destroyed. Like, why? Everything, he said something like, everything that gives life they destroy, which was a great line. So I give the guy high marks because he's focused on trying to make it clear to the rest of the world what exactly is happening. And it's very obvious that, for all of Ukraine's problems, why do I need to get into what their problems are? They're being, like, if somebody's being mugged, I don't stop and ask you, are you Baptist like I am? I'm gonna help it. I'm gonna help you. You're being mugged. I need to stop that from happening to this innocent victim.
Or the Nazi question. When I think about this, I think, are there white supremacist neo-Nazis in every country where there are white people? Probably, yeah.
Yeah, you said that the other day in one of your episodes.
Yeah.
And I said almost the same thing in a different context. Like, so yeah, are there somewhere? I'm sure there are, but there are some in our military too. There are some Black Panthers. There are some, I mean, and you even went to the universalization, if I recall this correctly. Like, every place where there are human beings, you'll find this kind of conduct or action or attitudes, right? Yeah. Isn't that about right?
Yeah,
I pay attention. Okay. And so that's right. That's exactly right.
But they're not in charge in Ukraine. They had no representation in parliament.
That's right. They had one in 2014. Right. What's the name of it? Not Right Factor or Right
Sector. Right
Sector. Yeah. That's right. They had one in 2014 and 0 in 2019. But that's the pretext that Putin uses, and he tells his people. By the way, in the dedication, I said this is dedicated to those that are in Ukraine who are fighting for their freedom, and to those Russians who are protesting against their government. Because God bless you, if you are protesting in Russia, you're not getting a free TV out of that. But right, I mean, like in a protest here where you're smashing and grabbing stuff, that's no, they're going to jail, and they know it.
You can't even.
There are people arrested. Yeah. There are people arrested for holding up a blank sign.
Yeah. There was a video that kind of went viral that I saw where somebody was protesting the war in Russia, and the jackbooted police come out in their gear, and they grab the person and they cart him away and throw him in a paddy wagon. And then this other person comes up to the camera, and she's going to give this oratory that is clearly, she's going to say, well, there are people that are against this, but I'm going to give the pro-Russian, the pro-military operation speech. And before she can even give it, they just think, oh, another dissident, and they pack her up in the paddy wagon too. So they're not even paying attention. You can be even mistake, if you're pro-Russian, you can be mistaken for the opposition just by talking. And I read Russian media. So talking about languages before, there's this whole thing about Ukrainian and Russian being mutually intelligible. Not really. Ukrainian was my first language. I never heard Russian really until later in life. And it was just out of curiosity. I went to go find out what it was all about. And over time of reading and studying and listening, I started to be able to understand it because of the baseline of Ukrainian that I had,
Sure.
knowing the Cyrillic alphabet, knowing the Slavic language. But there are so many, there are different grammar rules, there are different words for different things. And it's not that's why in Russia, for the most part, people will say, I don't understand Ukrainian because they didn't have exposure to it. But Ukrainians understand Russian because they did have exposure to it.
There's an analog. I've heard that that works the same way with the Spanish and the Portuguese, where one can understand the other, but the other can't understand the former. I don't remember which way it works.
But I don't even think it's that. I just think it's a matter of exposure. Like if I hear the Polish language, I know generally what's going on in Polish, because all Slavic languages have sort of a baseline of similar words and certain things like that, and certain things that are similar among all Slavic languages, or common words among all Slavic languages. But then they're all different. I mean, Ukrainian is closer to, I think, Serbian in the number of common words than it is to Russian, and Ukraine doesn't even border Serbia. So
that's interesting. So what do you learn from Russian media?
So the thing that stands out that I've seen lately is you can't even write the word war.
That's right. So yeah, now this is really interesting, and I studied this. So weekly, I update the Kindle book. I made it into a Kindle book because it's going to grow and evolve, right? I'm hoping 67 weeks from now, the war is not still going on. I'm hoping, because every week I add another chapter of week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4. And so last week, not this past week, but the week before, was this law in Russia that you get 15 years if you are speaking against the use of our soldiers for this special operation or something along the, it's very close to that kind of language. And they shut down Facebook, shut down Instagram. Twitter's been shut down for a while. Although I would point out, Putin still has an active Twitter account, which I find bizarre. How I don't even understand that, but okay.
Well, they want their message to leave Russia, but they don't want the Western message to get in.
So they shut down all the social media, but in 2022, it's really hard for this stuff not to leak out. I get doing that 20, 30 years ago, you could have really locked it down, but it's not, it's going to leak through now, and people are starting to
here's the level of absurdity of this. So I'm reading an article, I can't remember now which was the former chess champion, leader or head of the chess.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't remember. I can't pronounce his name either. Even if I did,
I'd have to look it up. I don't remember now, but he was some former high-ranking official, vice somebody or the other in the Russian leadership hierarchy, and he came out and said, generally, war is terrible generally, and my heart goes out to the Ukrainian civilians who are being hurt by this. But in the article that I read in Russian, the word war, it was censored like it was a curse word, but only in the so like vaina. So the letter B in the Latin alphabet makes a V sound in the Cyrillic alphabet. Sort of like Greek, or sort of like, the Phoenician Abba, that kind of thing. So you have the first letter V or B, and then the last letter. And then in between you have little asterisks. But they don't do that when you're talking about war generally as a concept. So you say, war is bad. If you just write that, I mean, I'm sure you might call attention to yourself. But up until you say war in Ukraine, you can use the term war. And so the absurdity is, in the same article, you have that word appear in certain contexts, but in other contexts, it's censored because, whoever's writing that article could find themselves in the gulag.
Yeah. I think in general, the sympathies of the people in Russia, if this is my read, and I could be wrong, are with Putin, but increasingly starting to be undermined because it's starting to leak. I don't know the degree to which that's the case, but it's trickling in, and you can see, with the amount of protesting that has gone, like something like 12 to 15,000 protesters have been arrested in Russia. By the way, while we're on numbers like that, the US estimate earlier last week, so this was a week ago, was 7,000 dead Russians. Okay, now that's important. Zelensky just claimed yesterday, I think it was, 16,000 dead Russians. Now, the truth somewhere in between. Let's conservatively say it's 11
You
or
may be
12.
combining injured with dead, or
No, not combining injured with dead. This is dead, right?
well,
So
no, he's saying that they're dead, but what I'm saying is those numbers could be a combination of those who flee, those who are injured, those
no,
who are dead.
those numbers are different. The numbers of flee are much higher, and whatever. So he's claiming he claimed 15,000 earlier the week, 16,000 dead now. But let's say the truth somewhere in between. Let's say it's 10,000. Okay, just for the sake of argument. Do you know that the Russians only lost 15,000 killed in 10 years in Afghanistan? Like, I got to give Ukrainians some props, man. Like, that is hardcore. If you can kill 10,000 Russian soldiers in a month, but they only lost 15,000 killed, 10,000 killed in a month, and they only lost 15,000 killed in Afghanistan in 10 years. In Afghanistan, in 10 years. Like, I respect.
It's not unprecedented though, and this is now under the microscope of media, but this has been the story all along. So let me kind of give you the narrative, because I think this might be interesting to you as someone who studies leadership, because all the way along Ukrainian history, there have been blunders by leaders. You can go all the way back to Kievan Rus in the medieval times, when in Kiev, they didn't have a clear route to succession. All the sons of the last prince had to kill each other over consolidating power. And so that was probably what led to the dissolution or the destruction of the Rus principality, and that allowed foreign invaders to come in, and why Kiev was sacked. But even then, when the Cossacks came, now they democratically elected their leadership, but then Khmelnytsky, this is, there's even in the Soviet era, there was a statue of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in Kiev. He's celebrated in Russia because he made a deal with the Tsar,
yeah,
to go against the Poles. And you kind of go through sort of the history of Ukrainian leadership, and there's always this, well, we've sided with Russia, or we made these blunders, and it always is to the detriment of Ukrainian statehood. Even 100 years ago, you might have heard about the Battle of Krute, where near Kiev, the Soviets were invading to take Ukraine again, and the Ukrainian forces were overpowered, essentially, killed to the last man. And part of it was because the government in Kiev didn't think that, like they maybe did a few months ago, they didn't think that the Russians were going to come and take them again.
okay. So there are two really interesting points there. One, so I've read a bunch of really interesting books. Ukraine by Suri Yekolov, whatever, I can't remember how to pronounce his last name. But if people are wanting to hear a good history of it, it's Oxford University Press, pretty solid. Ukraine's Maidan was really useful to understand what happened in 2014 and up to this day. But The Gates of Europe had this really interesting passage where they said, okay, so the Ottomans, the Poles, and the Russians are all fighting over this territory, and no matter who wins, the Ukrainians were going to lose. Like, it was going to, I mean, they're all fighting over the same thing, but the Ukrainians are getting the short end of the stick, just because whoever the victor is, it's going to be rough on the Ukrainians. And that's like, you have just like this crazy embattled history all throughout. So I'm tracking right there with you.
And then I want to get to how this plays with the Russian idea of Ukrainians, because I generally tend to think this, yeah, it's the government bad actors are the ones that we should be vilifying. Putin is responsible for this war. Yeah. However, the whole Russian system is rotten to its core, just like the Soviet system was. The edifice is painted rust. It's rust that's painted to look as if it's some kind of a structure that has substance to it, but it doesn't. And when Putin is replaced, or if he's replaced, either he dies or his cronies kill him, he's going to be replaced by another person that's exactly the same as he is, because this corruption that goes all the way through this power vertical, all the way up from to Putin all the way down to the school teacher that takes a bribe for a passing mark is endemic, and it's illustrative of a system that just needs to be reworked. And that's been the story of Russia from day one, from when Muscovy was called Russia, or even when it was Muscovy. They were they were paying tribute to the Ottomans. I might be getting this part of
Yeah,
history wrong,
I think that's right.
and they
So
were sandbagging.
so the
Right?
Kiev Rus is like the cultural center of the identity of the people that now consider themselves Russian, right? So
Russian
it's like
and
it's like
Belarus
you're
and
the
Ukraine. Yeah.
it's almost like Americans look back to the Brits. Is that you understand what I'm saying? Like we
Yeah.
our heritage. I look back fondly to 1215, right? The Magna Carta, because that gave us the Charter of Liberties, that gave us then the rights of Englishmen, that then gave us the, hey, you can't take away our rights as Englishmen, that gave us then our willingness to stand up to that. And so there's this heritage, but there it's different. Like the Brits don't look at us and go, well, we got to take you back. They kind of look at Americans like, hey, that's our big little brother.
Yeah.
So it's very different.
So you've seen the Ukrainian trident, I'm sure, the coat of arms of Ukraine,
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
So that was the coat of arms of another Volodymyr, other than, Putin is Vladimir, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yeah. I think that's fun
Uh,
too.
Volodymyr the Great, he was, the Prince of Kiev in the 980s. He's sort of like a type of George Washington figure in that he adopted the Orthodox Christian faith. He baptized the residents of Kiev in the river, in the Dnipro River, and the story goes in 988, Kievan Rus became a Christian nation. Right? There's a statue to him in Moscow. What's absent from that statue is his trident coat of arms, which is the trident coat of
Really?
arms of Ukraine. Right.
Because they adopt him as just being Russian as opposed to being
So when you
Ukrainian?
talk to someone who's got the Russian worldview, and I'm not saying that in a sense to sort of degrade anybody's cultural heritage, but there is Russians will say this themselves. There's a phrase in Russian, "Ruski mir," Russian world.
That's right.
And there's a Russian worldview, and that Russian worldview is that Russia is the rightful successor of Rus, that Ukraine and Ukrainians are Russian, and that there is no such thing as a Ukrainian state. And in fact, they have a term for Ukrainians that's quite pejorative. And I don't even mean the one that you might have heard, you might probably haven't, chachol. That's the more pejorative one. But the one that's even more common and has greater history is Little Russian.
Yes. Okay. So I understand that. And even didn't like Ukraine, wasn't it like called like the frontier or the outer lands or something along those lines?
There's dispute about that too, because the term Ukraine, right? In Ukrainian, it's Ukraina. Now the prefix U means in.
Okay.
There's another word in Ukrainian and Russian, Okraina, which means frontier land. It's got a different prefix.
Okay.
So krai can mean land, it can mean edge.
Okay. Yeah, the edge. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Right. But krai can also mean your land. So for example, Saint Sophia in Kiev, that's a famous church that goes back to the Kievan Rus era. When doing a construction on it or rehab, people found, and they had to bring, I guess, architects and people who know languages in, they found graffiti on that was layered over with brick. And the graffiti was sort of a prototypical Ukrainian phrase, which used a word that wasn't in the Russian language. This is from the 1100s, this graffiti, right? So there's already a difference among languages, even in that era, right? That's different from the Church Slavonic that was like the Latin in Roman Catholic churches up until Vatican II, where everything was in Latin. Just like there was an old Church Slavonic that was sort of the general language of official business. But the vernacular was different. So there was already a Ukrainian language, and there was already a Russian language back then. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who I alluded to before, had a translator when he went to go talk to the Tsar because they didn't speak the same language.
Mhm.
Um, the viewpoint, though, even when you talk to people who are from Russia, or mostly people from Russia who are in the United States, is that Putin's not a bad guy. He's worried about Russian security. And Ukrainians, what are you guys talking about? You're not a separate nation. That's nationalism. That's some kind of Nazi viewpoint that you're a different nation or a different group of people. Here's what I want to clear the air with. I was obviously raised by people. This is not a secret. I was raised by people who had a nationalistic view of Ukraine, in that it should be a free, independent country, and the Ukrainian language should be celebrated. But as it goes, as my viewpoints go, I don't care if you're blue or purple or white or black or gold or whatever, or what your background is, or what language you speak, or what religion you practice, or any of that stuff. The point is for me, is that you're not imposing your viewpoints
Sure.
or the way you want to live on anyone else. And that's what this struggle is all about. And that's what
exactly
this
right.
whole line is throughout history. So if
And I
I
think
self-identify as Ukrainian because I speak Ukrainian, I have Ukrainian heritage, or I value Ukrainian culture, then don't call me Russian, because I'm not Russian.
Yeah. So I think Americans who are objective third parties, like I am, I have nothing to, I don't have a dog in this fight, right? But I look at that, and American values dictate exactly what you said. Wait a minute, they have the right to their own destiny, however they want to. If they want to screw up their own country, let them screw up their own country. But you have no right to militarily invade and try to take it over and make them your vassal state or your slave or whatever it is that you're trying to do.
And even if Ukrainian, let's say, let me give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's say this is nothing I would ever concede in reality, but let's say, okay, Ukrainians are Russian, or there's some kind of brotherly nations. When you see video of people in occupied parts of Ukraine showing up in front of Russian tanks without guns, waving Ukrainian flags, or unfurling Ukrainian flags on buildings that have been occupied by Russian soldiers, immediately you think, who cares if what the ethnicity of those people are?
That's right.
That blue and yellow banner means freedom, and these Russian soldiers should go F off back to Moscow.
Yeah, and they got mad respect from the rest of the world because they took that stand. And these are values that Americans generally resonate with, regardless of which spectrum of the political, left, right, or middle. No, you have the right to your own self destiny as your country. And so I think that's really important. Now, I think that the perception of that is legitimately cultural in Russia, and it's not shared by legitimately by Ukrainians, and that's part of the thing. But I think there's more complicating. So before I started reading about Zelensky, I was reading about Putin days before this. Like, I'm like, okay, Putin's just saber rattling. He's like Kim Jong-un. He's just trying to get some concessions. Hey, we don't want them in NATO. We want this buffer. And I get some of his grievances, because if he says, like, well, the NATO alliance. No, here's the real amazingness about this whole thing. He says the NATO alliance, they promised the Soviets that they would not move an inch eastward, and then they did all these different countries. Okay, I get it legally, but the Soviet Union is no longer there. So legally, that's not an entity.
And
this is the
really
same Putin.
That?
Hold on, before you say anything, this is the same Putin that no longer recognizes the Minsk Treaty, the treaty that recognizes the sovereignty of Ukraine when they gave up nukes. They were a party to guaranteeing their borders. And Putin still says, oh, but that was a different government because it wasn't him. What? So which is it? You can't have it both ways.
He also said, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, he also said in the just before he declared this war, I was watching Russian TV the night before the 24th. I watched that Potemkin sort of, they had that Security Council show.
Oh man, wasn't that like,
that was bizarre.
So hold on, I gotta tell you, as a professor who deals with this kind of thing in organizations, I was looking at that like, I watched it after the fact, but I still watched it and was like, man, if you can't speak truth to power, you're lost. Like you're going
Well,
to
it
run
was
off the rails.
yeah,
And he did run off the rails, clearly.
it was this struggle session, a theater production of come in here. And Putin at one point, I said this before in the podcast, Putin at one point says, oh, just so we're clear, I didn't tell any of you, I didn't talk to any of you before this. I wanted you to come in here and give me your objective assessments without the influence of my talking to you. And everything that's said, every phrase, every syllable that's uttered by Putin and his cronies on television, every sort of shot is meticulously controlled to try to give some kind of a narrative. But then the art, I think he started to lose that as soon as that evening when he came back on television and declared war, because the control of the narrative is lost, even though they're struggling so hard to maintain this idea of this is not a war, it's a special operation, demilitarizing Ukraine, denazifying. None of this is resonating really outside in the West where Russian propaganda was before, but also,
and that's why the UN voted
yeah.
130 to 5 with 30 dissent, 30 who just didn't vote. But there are only 5 countries: China, not China, Russia, North Korea. I'm trying to remember who else.
India.
India, no, India? No, I don't think
India was in that mix.
Also, Iraq. I had to look it up. It was like just north of Somalia, some podunk thing that you never heard of. But there were like only 5 countries that were going to go along with that. The rest of the world can see right through it.
But the mask came off, and the absurdity of the arguments started to resurface. It was sort of like when Bush was president, and there was that, the State Department leaked that Putin said Ukraine was not a real country then, but he denied, I think Lavrov denied him saying that then. Now he's saying it openly. He's saying that there is no tradition of statehood from Ukraine, as if that's some kind of legal precedent to not allow the Ukrainians to have their own state. Or the thing that was chilling to me was, you want decommunization, because the policy of Ukraine since 2014 has been to take symbolism,
all
and
the statues down,
of anything associated with the Soviet Union. And good on them. I mean, as an American, when you think about free speech in America, it doesn't really comport, but then you have to take it in the context of what they're talking about. They've shaken off the yoke of oppression. Now that's trying to and as soon as they try to symbolically get rid of it, it comes back 30 years later. And Putin says in the speech leading up to when he declared war that, okay, you want decommunization. Well, in his worldview, Ukraine was created by Soviet Russia. So we're going to take Ukraine away because communism created Ukraine, as if that's even remotely historically accurate.
Yeah. The only thing that is, I'm not saying that he should have done this, right? But the only thing that is somewhat legit is Crimea, because it was given to Ukraine during the Soviet Union by, what was it, Khrushchev in 54, I think. So that's the closest thing. And I'm not saying that they should have done this either, but that's the closest thing to any legitimacy that he might have for a claim. But remember, go through any period in time. So I did my,
well, I just want to say this. I would even challenge you on Crimea, because if you look at,
I'm not standing on that ground. I'm not standing on that ground saying this is a good thing. I'm saying that's the only thing that comes even remotely close to it. I'm not saying that they should have done that. Please don't.
Well, I mean, the borders of Europe have changed so often, right?
That's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah. I did my master's thesis on the Nazis, right? Public policy master's thesis on the Third Reich, and so I'm reading Mein Kampf and throughout it. And Hitler actually started out with this first 40 pages were like really interesting read of what was going on, and then he said, and it's all because of the Jews, and all goes down from there, right? But at one point he says, like, which borders do we use? Do we use the borders from this year or from this year or from that year? And that's how he's making the argument. And Putin's doing the same thing. Now, I got in a lot of trouble on Facebook with people because I put this reflection of this picture up that somebody else created that was a picture of Putin sitting on a train, and then the reflection is Hitler.
Yeah, I've seen
and it's
that.
Only a matter of time before you actually get to that. It depends on how much you appease Putin to how much he becomes like Hitler.
So the arguments are the same.
Yeah, the arguments, the way that the tactics, and people would they just ate my lunch. They were saying, oh, well, you just don't understand how Hitler was this and Putin is that. I understand. I really do understand. I've been watching this. I've been studying these kinds of things. Um, so what Hitler did with his we got to go protect these Germans in Poland that are being repressed. The pretext, it's the same stuff. So if Putin could do the same thing in Ukraine, and Putin wanted to roll in and take over, and the U.S. intelligence estimate was he was going to knock over the country in a few days. That is what led to, do you want to safe passage out, which led to, I need ammunition, I don't need a ride, and Putin's worst nightmare, because now Putin has been pantsed in front of the world. I mean, that's really what's happened. Zelensky, I mean, like, nobody thought little Ukraine was gonna, like this. Look at the map. The map is like how people think about what the differential is, and it's really not. It's 3-1. It's not, this like largest country on earth to this, size of the state of Texas. It's not really that, but it feels like that. But Putin's been shown as this, you talked about painted over rust, right? He's been shown that it's been hollowed out. The logistics are not there. The morale is poor. They took on, I mean, they never coordinated military and air support and whatever else. So all these kind of things, it's been shown that he's not what he seemed to be. And Zelensky's the one that did it to him. And I think if Putin could go back to the 23rd, he would do things differently. I also think that Putin needs to save face, because he can't not, I mean, he's got to keep going forward, because he can't not lose. Like, that's the way his calculus works.
And I want to cap off the conversation sort of about that topic, because I was talking to military experts before this invasion who were saying this is going to break the backs of the Russian forces. They don't have enough to occupy. Yeah, the population, the territory is much larger, but population is only 3-1. Obviously, the will to defend your own home is much stronger than for some kid to be thrown into the meat grinder without a clear objective of what they're doing. But yeah, I can't even begin to speculate what the end game is. Is Putin going to try to save face and regroup, or is he going to go nuclear? Who knows? We can't possibly know that.
I think this is my read, and I could be wrong. I understand Zelensky, and so I understand the peripheral around it enough that this is what I think is a studied opinion, but I could be wrong. I think Putin is tried to get a puppet regime over Ukraine. I think that was his full goal. Now I think he's going for a consolation. Huh?
It's been his goal for 20 years. He just tried
no, but I mean, that's his goal in militarily invading.
Yeah.
If you look at what he's doing with Mariupol, if you look at Kherson, if you look at Odessa, he's trying to create now cut off a part of the country to have more of another state that is really Russia by another name. So he's trying to create a land bridge all the way down to Odessa. And if he can do that, that's his consolation prize. And in doing that, he also grabs the strategic oil and gas reserves in the Black Sea and landlocks Ukraine, making them more dependent theoretically on him, but probably on the West. So he'll get extra territory to expand and get all those resources. But I think that's what he's going for now as a consolation prize, and will not call for any kind of ceasefire until he can grab that extra land. I don't know that it's going to work, but I do believe that that's his goal at this point, which was he's not getting the whole thing, I don't think. It's amazing that a month later we can say that, because the middle school kid with the butcher knife has now cut him up pretty good. And it's not cool to beat up a middle school kid, but it's even less cool to get beat up by a middle school kid. And that's what's going on now.
I think I don't agree with that assessment. Here's why. So
which part of the assessment?
So about sort of like the comparison of Ukraine, let me put it this way. The comparison of Ukraine as a middle school kid, partly, and the assessment of what you think Putin is after. And here's why. I'll make it as succinct as possible.
Go ahead.
So leading up to this, the Ukrainian authorities, surprisingly at the time, didn't seem to, or they signaled they weren't taking it seriously in the same way that, Joe Biden, for example, was coming on TV every day and saying, we have intelligence that the Russians are going to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And maybe part of that was, and I'll say maybe to Zelensky's credit, even though I thought of this as something I would criticize him for at that point was, hey, why aren't you preparing more? Because maybe they thought they know the Russians better than anybody else. They've been fighting them for 8 years. Heck, there have been conflicts between Ukrainians and Russians for hundreds of years. So, well, not even conflicts, but invasions and repulsion of invasions. Let's put it that way. The Ukrainians probably knew the Russians and Putin would be crazy to do this. Like those some of those lone experts were saying, hey, they don't have enough forces. This is going to break their backs. But as for, I can't claim to be able to read Putin's mind. But when I look at the rhetoric, when I look at it in context of where he comes from as a KGB agent who cares nothing about life and who talks about Ukrainians being Russian, or he joked before this reinvasion, joked about Ukrainians as a woman lying there and taking it. His worldview is that Ukraine has no legitimacy. It's not a real thing. Anybody calling themselves Ukrainian or purporting to be a Ukrainian patriot should be liquidated, that Ukraine is a construct created by Bolshevik Russia. And I view this as like you were saying, as a Hitler who's trying to wipe a peoples off the face of the planet. And I don't know that, I'm not saying he's irrational, and I'm not saying that he is rational, but I don't think that a Novorossiya or just some bit of territory is going to suffice for him.
No, so yeah, and in the analog, Hitler said he would have stopped if it wasn't for the Sudetenland. Like if he was stopped at the Sudetenland, like once he got the green light there, he was like, hey, that was easy. And then he rolls over Poland, and now we're into World War II. So I don't think this will suffice for him either. But his plan, had he knocked over Ukraine, I would have been very nervous if I was Moldova and Finland.
Poland. Right? I'd be nervous even if I was.
Well, Poland has a little bit more because at least has the parchment barrier of NATO, whether that'll hold or not, with Putin's saber rattling about nukes.
But I would argue that NATO's support of Ukraine has signaled to Putin, you better not mess with us, because I think he expected it to fold.
That's right. And so if he had been successful in Ukraine on that first couple of days, I was saying, man, if I'm in Moldova, I'm getting out of the country. If I'm in Taiwan, I'm getting out of Taiwan too, because that's a signal to President Xi in China. Like if Putin can do this, why can't I take Taiwan? Sure, it's my territory anyway. It's a very similar kind of thing. I gave the example. Okay, so you were talking about the middle school thing. You didn't like that one as well, but I'm gonna update that a little bit for you in just a moment. Tell me what you want to push back on with that, because they're not a middle schooler. They're really tougher.
No, I would say this. It's not that much of an imbalanced fight. So the Ukrainian forces are trained up. There have been a lot of reforms and training since
2014.
Right.
That's right. So it's almost a blessing that Putin did what he did in 2014. It's not, right? But it's almost a good thing that he did, because it signaled like we got to do something about this. And I give an example in the book where I say it's like this. The bully is picking on the 99-pound weakling, and then at
the home invasion analogy is legitimate. I give you that. I think the home invasion analogy is legitimate. It's just that Ukrainians were underestimated.
Yeah, that's what I say. Let me give the analogy. It's like the bully at the end of the school year goes and picks on a 99-pound weakling, and then that kid goes home and trains in boxing all summer. And then when the bully tries it again at the beginning of the school year, he gets a free boxing lesson, right?
But
that's only that, kind of what happened.
Yeah, but what we're discounting too is that the people, even people without military training, are making Molotov cocktails, are people with whatever their profession is. If they're tech people, they're figuring out ways to help the Ukrainian side with technology. People are defending their homes. It's like the United States in Vietnam. Why didn't the United States roll over Vietnam? Because you have people on their land with nothing to lose, because there's no place to go. Right? I mean, yes, women and children, there are refugees, older people, sure, but the men that are staying, those 18 to 60 men, they can't leave. They have no place to go. Their backs are to the wall. And like Zelensky was saying, you're going to have to kill every single one of us and replace us if you want this land.
So if Putin does win the prize that he hopes to win and can take the land and try to occupy it, he will bleed himself out, because there's no scenario in which he can actually hold and occupy.
Yeah.
No scenario. You'll have it'll be more devastating. Like if he wins what he's trying to get, it'll be even more devastating than if he loses. And I think he understands that enough, which is why I think he's trying to pull that strip in order to claim territory, save face, get those resources, and then say, see, our special invasion, whatever, was successful. That's why I think what I think. So I could be wrong. I may very well be. I'm a little out of my depth on the military strategy. I understand Zelensky a whole lot better, and I understand Putin reasonably well. I started studying Putin, and I was like, man, he's dark. Who's this Zelensky guy who just said, I need ammunition? I need to study him.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. And maybe, and let's say that you're right. Let's say that that's how the scenario plays out. Then I think, and this is also maybe away from the, well, not necessarily, because when it comes to leadership in the West, then what we have to do is not take our eye off the ball. And as citizens of Western countries, we have to hold our elected officials accountable for not, if Putin takes the tact of, okay, I'm going to retreat and regroup, that we don't then start to relax the sanctions or say, okay, now we're going to bring you back into the world fold. We have to keep the pressure on, and up until the entire, in my view, this is my view, obviously, until all of the territory, including Crimea of Ukraine, is restored, and whatever authoritarian regime, or hopefully not in the future, remains in Russia, stays inside its own territory.
I don't know how this plays out. So you're a lawyer, right? So you have a probably a better sense of this than I do. But Putin's not going to, I don't think, negotiate until he can claim some kind of victory over the strip of whatever land that he thinks he can grab. But I don't think you should grab it. I mean, I think you should take a big chunk of Russia and give it to Ukraine as a compensation or something. I don't know how you do this, but you got to compensate the people. You just blew up a huge chunk, 1,100 missiles over the last month. Like,
well, I think
how
he
do you
belongs in the
compensate
Hague.
that?
I think he belongs in the Hague. I don't think he should even be allowed to negotiate. I think he's a war criminal.
He
belongs
definitely
in
is a
the
war
Hague.
criminal. I cite the Geneva Convention. I put it as an appendix, Article 8 of the Geneva Convention in the book, just because like clearly he is doing things that are violating international rules, and he doesn't care. Now there's a great book called Putin's Playbook. And if you look, and the author really kind of helps map out Putin's brain, just the way he thinks about things. So he actually thinks that doing these things are going to bring the people to their knees quicker and end the war faster. So if you do that, but I think it's doing the opposite. It's causing them to, even if you were like at all ambivalent about this, you are now picking up a weapon, because you're going to like, no, this is wrong. I'm not going to let this happen to my family, to my neighborhood, to whatever. And so he just has a different way of thinking about this, just like he thinks about his worldview is very different about what Ukraine is than the Ukrainians' worldview. So
Yeah,
but I don't know how you get them to save face. The sooner you can get them to save face and go ahead.
There's no resolution to this. There's no negotiated peace that I can think of that would be justifiable, especially from the Ukrainian perspective. It's that Russia, I'm sure that this is the viewpoint. Russia must be defeated, and entirely.
Yes, and I think that's what is most likely to happen, to really stop and create a final resolution. I don't think I think so. Putin will stop at one of two places. Either he carves out a position, declares victory, and says our special operation is done, we can now go home, or he's just totally devastated. And I don't think he'll stop till he gets to one of those two things. That's my read.
Or he dies of natural causes, or his circle takes him out. Who knows?
Okay, it could. So volitionally, I don't think he stops without one of those two things. But again, going back full circle to what we're talking about, Zelensky and whatever, Zelensky's been his worst nightmare. And the fascinating thing was, Poroshenko was saying Zelensky, he won't be able to stand up to Russia. Oops, egg on his face.
And now they're working together.
What's yeah, Poroshenko's out in the streets in body armor, leading his little faction of whatever he's responsible for. I'm not exactly sure what he's responsible for, but I saw him on the news. I was like, hey, that's Poroshenko. He's out there,
I mean,
right?
essentially, he became an opposition politician, but this is where Ukraine developed different from Russia. Whereas if there's a legitimate opposition in Russia, like a Navalny character, they put him, or they put him in prison, or they poison him, they kill him. In Ukraine, the opposition, like in the like you'd have in the British Parliament or in Canada, or hopefully in the United States, although we're degrading into too much partisan bickering, but it's a loyal opposition in that
Sure.
we're not a fifth column, we're not your enemy. We
Yeah.
want the same thing. We want a Ukrainian a functioning state, a functioning democracy where people can raise their families and pursue their dreams without worrying about corruption or the lack of justice or whatever else you have in authoritarian regimes. And that's what it is. It's a worldview. It's whether you want it. What's going on the territory of Ukraine is this philosophical struggle that's been going on for all of the history of humanity. Do we want to live as free people, or do we want to live as slaves to a master? And clearly the majority of people, nobody wants to be a slave to a master, right? And so it's the natural human state of rebelling against authority, of rebelling against authoritarianism. And if the West somehow falters in its support of Ukraine, or if Zelensky somehow doesn't hold up his promises of staying as a one-term guy and leaving after victory, or kind of leaning towards these sort of semi-authoritarian things about banning political parties or other viewpoints. If something like that were to happen, then this whole thing is for nothing, and it'll be an utter failure.
Yeah, so you said slaves to a master. Let me read a little passage. I just quickly did a little find in, because I have Zelensky's speeches up on my computer here. On the 21st, he said, to Kherson, where today we saw slaves shooting at free people. Think about the language. I mean, the guy's masterful at he's a communicator in chief, right? Where he saw slaves shooting at free people, slaves of propaganda that replaces their consciousness, slaves who used to pack everyone in the paddy wagons, even an old woman with a clean white poster. That's what I was talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Even a girl with an A4 sheet on which was written only one word, peace. These slaves sent by Russia have never seen so many free people in the squares and the streets. They have never seen thousands of people who are not afraid of them, of slaves with weapons in their hands. Slaves perceive freedom as savagery and danger. They are scared. They fear that propagandists know how to turn into hatred. And then shots at a free, peaceful people. I don't know how you could write any better than that. I mean, that is exactly right. It's not David and Goliath. What we found is that Goliath is kind of an optical illusion, and I mean, really, and they're slaves to this, and like the morale of those soldiers is so little compared. I mean, and morale is really part of the big differentiator. In the book, I talk about George Marshall, and George Marshall was the general in charge of all U.S. forces in like we think about Eisenhower and we think about what's his name, Doug MacArthur in the Eastern Front, but Marshall was at home and he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or whatever his position was. And he's talking about, this is in December 1941, just before the just before Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor had not happened yet, and he's talking about morale. And he's giving this speech as a commencement address. Let me Google this, or not Google it, but let me just pull it up on a find. Morale. Because it's really profound. He says, one of the most interesting and important phenomena in the last war was the emergence of that French word morale, from a comparative obscurity to the widespread usage in all the armies. And then skip a little bit. He talks about the we talk about armies as mechanized machines, but he says underlying it all, the effort back of all this essential material and industrial effort is the realization that the primary instrument of warfare is the fighting man. All the weapons with which we arm him are merely tools to enable him to carry out his mission. That's right. So Ukrainians have morale in spades. The Russians, it's very little. I mean, they don't want to get killed, right? They don't want their own people to kill them or their own officers to kill them, but the morale differential. And this is where Zelensky is huge, because every speech he is saying, here's what's happening, here's the atrocities, here's how you're fighting back here, and or we're calling for help and saying this is our fight is your fight. But everything is calculated to inculcate the most morale. And I mean, I'm just so impressed with how he's acted.
Well, on that note, Darren, thank you so much for spending this much time with me. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm hoping that you and I can keep talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome to come on the Leadersmith podcast as well.
I'll be there.
All right. Have a good one.
Thank you.